General concepts and guidelines for physical activity participation for children and adolescents are presented. The 2008 Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans are different for youth than for adults. A key point here is that physical activity promotion in youth can directly benefit their health but may also make lifetime physical activity participation somewhat more likely. School-based approaches for physical activity promotion are presented, and a key point is that when done well, e.g., quality. School-based physical education is an evidence-based strategy for successful physical activity promotion. A discussion point is how can school-based physical education be more broadly implemented and what are the downsides? The general idea is that school policies and norms can sometimes be difficult to change. Think of this question: can and should schools implement physical activity programs? In the United States, over 54 million children and adolescents attend public and private elementary and secondary schools, where they spend approximately 6.5 hours per day for an average of 180 days per year. Additionally, over 1.1 million children attend pre-K schools, and more than 11.5 million older adolescents attend community colleges or universities. This makes schools very attractive environments in which to promote physical activity. There is no evidence that time spent in physical activity or PE has negative influences on academic achievement. And emerging evidence suggests that physical activity positively influences academic achievement. In terms of the relationship between physical education and academic performance, many parents may worry that physical education may occupy students' instruction time in core subjects. One recent study examined the relationship between the amount of time spent in physical education class and academic performance. Academic performance was measured using standardized mathematics and reading exams developed by the National Center for Education Statistics. This study followed a nationally representative sample of 5,316 students starting in kindergarten through 5th grade. The results showed that girls who participated in higher amounts of physical education had better math and reading test scores compared with girls with minimal amounts of physical education. These findings were not seen in boys. However, no negative effects on test scores were among boys in the study. Since physical activity should be promoted in school-based settings. Answers may vary but include the following. Because of the number of students they serve, schools at all levels are attractive public venues at which to disseminate positive physical activity messages and promote active lifestyles. Mandating increased physical activity in schools has also become popular. Because policymakers believe that it can improve the adherence of students to varied curricular-based education to combat obesity, overweight, and diabetes. Versus voluntary compliance to lifestyle change. In addition to PE, schools are increasingly looking to integrate physical activity into other parts of students' lives. Current best practices include pre-kindergarten pre-K programs, kindergarten programs, before-school programs, classroom activity breaks, recess breaks, after-school programs, commercially sponsored programs, and summer seasonal programs. Then, you may consider this question. Do physical activity make children smarter? Activity important for schools. Because physical activity is associated with lower levels of stress and anxiety among children and adolescents. Research shows that physical activity can positively affect their concentration, memory, and classroom behavior among adolescents. One of the main concerns among educators is that spending more time in physical education class will negatively impact students' standardized test scores. However, research has not found this to be the case. Research shows that spending more time in physical education class does not negatively affect scores on standardized tests, and in some cases, can actually improve test scores. What are 3 goals of Healthy People 2020 related to increasing school-based physical activity? Answers may vary but include the following: increase the proportion of adolescents who meet current federal guidelines for aerobic physical activity and for muscle strengthening activity. Increase the proportion of the nation's public and private schools that require daily PE for all students. Increase the proportion of adolescents who participate in daily school PE. Increase regularly scheduled elementary school recess. Increase the proportion of school districts that require or recommend elementary school recess for an appropriate period of time. Increase the number of states that require licensed child care programs to provide physical activity. Increase the proportion of the nation's public and private schools that provide access to their physical activity spaces and facilities for all people outside of normal school hours, i.e., before and after the school day, on weekends, and during summer and other vacations. Physical activity is a bodily movement that uses energy to contract muscles. Physical activity can be structured, like playing on a basketball team, or unstructured, like playing tag outside or riding bikes. Physical activity can also be part of everyday activities such as taking the dog for a walk or sweeping the floor. There are many health benefits associated with regular physical activity. Physically active youth have higher levels of cardiovascular fitness compared with youth who are inactive. Physical activity helps to build and maintain stronger bones and muscles. Many of the risk factors for chronic diseases, including heart disease, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes, begin to develop early in life. Regular physical activity reduces the risk of developing these risk factors and of becoming obese. Regular physical activity also reduces the symptoms of anxiety and depression. Research shows that physical activity among adolescents can positively affect their concentration, memory, and classroom behavior. Establishing regular physical activity early in life makes it more likely that children will remain healthy as adults. In 8, the federal government published the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans to provide information and guidance to policymakers, health professionals, and members of the public on the types and amounts of physical activity that provide substantial health benefits. These are the first physical activity guidelines ever to be published by the federal government. The guidelines are science-based recommendations for persons aged 6 and older, including children and adolescents aged 6, 17. The Physical Activity Guidelines for Children and Adolescents state that children and adolescents should do 1 hour 60 minutes or more of physical activity per day. The guidelines state that the physical activity should at least be of moderate intensity, and include vigorous intensity activities at least 3 days per week. Muscle strengthening and bone strengthening activities should each be included at least 3 days a week, as part of the 60 minutes of daily physical activity. Each of these types of physical activity offer important health benefits. At first glance, these guidelines might appear complicated. However, keep in mind the following 2 key points. Vigorous, muscle strengthening, and bone strengthening activities should be part of the 60 minutes of daily physical activity. Too many physical activities combine vigorous activity, muscle strengthening, and bone strengthening. For example, jumping rope is both vigorous and bone strengthening. The guidelines also emphasize the importance of participating in a variety of activities that are age-appropriate and enjoyable. Actually mean. The key points to remember are that children and adolescents should do at least 60 minutes of physical activity every day, and most of the 60 minutes should be spent doing aerobic activities. It is very important that children and adolescents participate in a variety of activities, especially activities that they enjoy. This enhances skill development, reduces the risk of overuse injuries, and increases the likelihood of continuing to be active as they get older. It is also important to know that the guidelines take into consideration the natural activity patterns of children. Children often move between short bursts of activity and short periods of rest. All episodes of moderate or vigorous intensity activities count towards the daily requirement. Unstructured active play can provide all three types of physical activity. Talk about each of the three types of physical activity outlined in the guidelines. The first is aerobic activity. Aerobic activities keep your body moving enough to increase your heart rate and make you breathe harder. There are two intensities of aerobic activity. 1 moderate intensity. 2 vigorous intensity. Examples of aerobic activities include running, hopping, skipping, jumping rope, swimming, dancing, and bicycling. The intensity levels of these activities can be either moderate or vigorous depending on factors such as speed and level of effort. Adolescents can meet the guidelines by doing a combination of moderate and vigorous intensity aerobic physical activities. However, youth should not only do moderate intensity activity. It is important to include vigorous intensity activities because they can help to improve cardiorespiratory fitness. What is the difference between moderate and vigorous intensity activities? It can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between moderate and vigorous intensity activities. As a rule of thumb, on a scale of 0 to 10, where sitting is a 0 and the highest level of effort possible is 10, moderate intensity activity is a 5 or 6. Young people doing moderate intensity physical activity will notice their heart beating faster than normal and breathing will be harder than normal. Vigorous intensity activity is a 7 or 8 out of 10. Young people doing vigorous intensity activity will notice their heart beating much faster than normal and breathing will be much harder than normal. The same activities, such as bike riding or walking, could be a moderate or vigorous intensity activity, depending upon the amount of energy the person is exerting. Examples of moderate and vigorous intensity aerobic activities for children and adolescents. As you can see, some of the activities are appropriate for both age groups and can be either moderate or vigorous intensity depending on the level of effort. The second type of physical activity outlined in the Physical Activity Guidelines for Children and Adolescents is muscle strengthening activity. Muscle strengthening activities make muscles do more work than the usual activities of daily life. Children can increase their muscle strength through unstructured activities that involve lifting or moving their own body weight. Examples of muscle strengthening activities from unstructured play include playing on playground equipment, climbing trees, and playing tug of war. Muscle strengthening activities also can be structured activities such push UPS and pull UPS, working with resistance bands or lifting weights. Let's look at some other examples of muscle strengthening activities that are appropriate for children and adolescents. This chart shows examples of muscle strengthening activities for children and adolescents. It is important to point out that some activities meet the criteria for more than one type of physical activity. Two examples are gymnastics and rowing. Both activities can be moderate or vigorous aerobic activity, depending on the level of exertions, and both activities are also muscle strengthening. These physical activities allow young people to maximize the health benefits gained from both aerobic and muscle strengthening activities at once. The third type of activity outlined in the guidelines for children and adolescents is bone strengthening activity. Bone strengthening activities produce a force on the bones that promotes bone growth and strength. This force is usually produced by an impact with the ground. These activities are especially important for youth because the greatest gains in bone mass occur during the years just before and during puberty. And the majority of peak bone mass is obtained by the end of adolescence. Let's look at some examples of bone strengthening activities for children and adolescents. This chart provides examples of bone strengthening activities that are appropriate for children and adolescents. As you can see, some of these activities are also aerobic and muscle strengthening. For example, running can be a vigorous aerobic activity as well as a bone strengthening activity. It is worth noting the differences between the physical activity guidelines for youth compared with the guidelines for adults. The adult guidelines count episodes of physical activity that are at least 10 minutes in duration towards the total target amount. However, the youth guidelines account for the intermittent activity patterns of children and count all episodes of moderate or vigorous intensity activity towards the daily requirement, regardless of duration. The guidelines for youth also specify that all of a child's activity needs can be met through active play. The guidelines for adults provide a minimum number of minutes of physical activity required for the week. Adults can decide how to distribute this time throughout the week. However, in order for children and adolescents to gain comprehensive health benefits, they require 60 minutes of physical activity every day. The guidelines for adults include increased bone strength as a benefit of muscle strengthening activities. However, because of the importance of bone development during childhood and adolescence, the guidelines for youth specify the need for bone strengthening activities each week. In addition, the guidelines for youth emphasize the need for both moderate and vigorous intensity activities. Whereas the adult guidelines require different amounts of physical activity depending on the intensity level. Each of these differences takes into account the developmental needs and natural activity patterns of youth.